Rude mouthy chav calls the king's guard. A sausage tries to fight and gets handcuffed. The king's guard. Tourists from all over the world had gathered near the palace gates, cameras ready, eager to catch a glimpse of the ceremonial display that had fascinated people for centuries. The air was filled with a mixture of excitement, curiosity, and the low hum of conversation as people jostled slightly to get the best view. Among the crowd, a young man stood out, not because of his attire or any sense of refinement, but because of the way he carried himself. He had a loud voice, a confident swagger, and a look on his face that said he wanted attention. People nearby whispered to one another, noting his presence, some with mild amusement and others with mild concern. It was the kind of energy that either made you want to laugh or look away quickly. He had clearly been observing the guards for a while, and a mischievous grin spread across his face. His eyes darted from one guard to another, taking in the sharp uniforms, the shining buttons, and the tall, imposing hats that made them seem almost larger than life. There was a sort of reverence in the air. Even people who weren't particularly interested in royalty felt a strange respect for the disciplined figures standing so perfectly still. Yet, he seemed intent on disrupting that calm. Finally, unable to contain himself, he shouted, loud enough for several people around him to flinch. "Oi, you're just a sausage!" The words echoed across the plaza, drawing a mix of gasps, chuckles, and confused looks from those nearby. Cameras paused mid-click, and a few children stared wide-eyed, unsure if this was a game or something more serious. The guard, standing perfectly erect, did not react. His expression remained solemn, almost as if the words had bounced harmlessly off an invisible wall. His posture was impeccable, a combination of years of training and discipline that had been instilled in him since he first became part of the royal regiment. For the young man, this was both irritating and intriguing. He had expected some sort of reaction, perhaps a frown, a shake of the head, or at least a twitch of annoyance. Instead, he faced stoic silence. The crowd around him was starting to murmur. Some were laughing quietly, amused by the audacity of the young man. Others shook their heads, clearly disapproving of someone treating a ceremonial guard with such irreverence. A few people tried to gently guide him toward quieter behavior, whispering warnings and asking him to calm down. "Don't bother them," one person said softly. "They're just doing their job." But the young man ignored them. He thrived on the attention, feeling a strange mix of power and excitement. Every glance from the crowd seemed to feed his confidence, encouraging him to push further. He leaned slightly forward, raised his voice even more, and added, "Yeah, come on. Move if you dare. Bet you won't even blink." His words were punctuated with exaggerated gestures, his hands slicing through the air for emphasis. It wasn't just about the insult anymore. It was a challenge. People instinctively stepped back, giving him space, sensing that he might escalate the situation if anyone tried to intervene directly. The atmosphere, once calm and ceremonial, had shifted slightly. An undercurrent of tension had crept into the air. Cameras were still clicking, but now some people were filming more cautiously, aware that something unpredictable might happen. A bystander, observing the scene from a few steps away, felt a growing sense of unease. He was calm, composed, and careful with his words, but he recognized the signs of someone pushing boundaries too far. "You should stop," he said, raising his voice just enough to be heard over the commotion. "They're not here to play games." The young man turned sharply toward him, his expression changing from amusement to a mix of irritation and challenge. He took a step closer, ignoring the subtle shifts of the crowd as people moved away. "And who's going to stop me, huh? You." His tone was daring, almost taunting, as if testing whether anyone had the courage to confront him. The bystander did not step back. He remained steady, hands relaxed but ready to act if needed. He watched the young man carefully, analyzing every twitch of his body, every word he spoke. He knew that this confrontation could go one of two ways. Either it would fizzle out with the young man embarrassed and leaving, or it could spiral into a physical altercation if provoked further. Meanwhile, the other spectators were holding their breath, sensing that the moment had become delicate. The king's guard, still unflinching, seemed almost to embody the calm at the center of a storm. Their presence alone was enough to hold back the crowd from reacting impulsively. People began murmuring among themselves, commenting on how impressive it was that the guards could remain so perfectly still, unbothered by insults or gestures. The young man, frustrated by the lack of reaction from both the guard and the bystander, decided to escalate further. His gestures became wilder, his voice louder and his insults sharper, but still within the limits of civility. He waved his hands dramatically, pacing slightly, clearly enjoying the chaos he was creating. It was no longer about the guards. It was about asserting dominance over the crowd, showing that he could disrupt the serenity of the palace grounds with nothing more than words and bravado. As he spoke, he caught the eye of a few other spectators who had been silent until now. Some rolled their eyes, clearly unimpressed by his antics. Others couldn't help but chuckle quietly, entertained by the audacity of his behavior. Even among those who disapproved, there was a reluctant fascination. People wanted to see what he would do next, whether he would escalate further or finally be humbled by the situation. The bystander, meanwhile, remained a steady presence, observing and calculating. He could see the pattern of behavior, recognizing that the young man's bravado was a mask for insecurity. He knew that intervening physically would only make things worse, and so he chose instead to maintain calm authority, speaking in a voice that was firm but non-threatening. "Please stop. You don't want trouble here." The young man paused for a moment, caught between continuing his performance and taking the advice seriously. He looked at the guard again, his eyes narrowing, trying to provoke a reaction that still did not come. The silence was almost louder than words, a testament to the discipline and composure of the ceremonial guard. The stillness in their stance seemed to amplify the chaos around him, making his own movements and words feel even more exaggerated in comparison. And yet, despite the crowd's mixed reactions and the bystanders' calm warnings, he could not stop himself. There was a thrill in the confrontation, a sense of being at the center of attention that was hard to resist. He shouted once more, louder than before, a mix of insult and challenge, feeling the energy of the crowd feeding into his performance. People whispered among themselves, unsure whether to intervene, to laugh, or to move away entirely. It was a moment suspended between order and chaos, a delicate balance where the young man's behavior tested the limits of public decorum without immediately breaking them. And through it all, the king's guard remained motionless, a living symbol of discipline and restraint, commanding respect not through anger or force, but through quiet, unwavering presence. In that moment, the young man's antics highlighted not only his own boldness, but also the remarkable poise of those he sought to provoke. The plaza had become a stage, the crowd an audience, and the tension a silent narrative of human behavior. Impulsiveness confronted by calm authority, bravado measured against discipline, and the curious spectacle of how far one could push boundaries before the inevitable. Consequences arrived. The morning sunlight continued to shimmer on the polished boots. The crisp air carried the mixed sounds of murmurs and laughter, and the young man, undeterred, prepared to take the next step in his bold, chaotic performance. What would happen next was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The day at the palace gates had already turned into a story worth telling. The young man, emboldened by the lack of response from the king's guard and the crowd, felt a surge of energy. The murmurs and chuckles of the bystanders seemed to fuel him even more. He had the attention of everyone nearby, and he wasn't about to give it up. His chest puffed slightly, and his voice rose once again, more insistent than before. Some onlookers began to step back further, sensing that the situation might escalate. Families with children moved closer together, shielding the little ones from the young man's loud gestures. A group of tourists whispered nervously among themselves, unsure whether to leave or stay to witness the unfolding scene. Everyone's attention was focused on him, the young man who seemed determined to be the center of chaos in an otherwise calm morning. "You think you're tough just standing there," he shouted toward the guards, although he did not really expect an answer. He gestured with exaggerated movements, hopping from one foot to another, as if the sheer energy of his body could somehow provoke a reaction. "Come on, move. Do something." The guard, however, remained perfectly still, their eyes forward, their posture unshakable. Every button on their uniform gleamed in the sunlight, their tall hats casting sharp shadows on their faces. The silence from them was not empty, it carried authority. It was as if the air itself respected the rules of discipline that had been followed for generations. A bystander standing a few feet away continued to observe quietly, maintaining a calm presence. He could see that the young man's behavior was beginning to irritate not only himself, but also others around him. People were now starting to murmur more loudly, some warning him quietly, others just commenting to their friends. "He really shouldn't be doing this," one woman said, shaking her head. "Why can't he just leave them alone?" The young man turned his attention toward the bystander, his frustration evident. He had expected a strong reaction from the guards, but when none came, he tried to redirect his energy towards someone who had actually spoken to him. "And who are you, huh?" he shouted, pointing a finger in the bystander's direction. "Think you can tell me what to do?" The bystander did not flinch. He stayed still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his voice calm but firm. "I'm only asking you to stop. You're upsetting people, and it's not safe to act like this in a crowded area," he said. He did not raise his voice aggressively, but there was a clear note of authority in his tone. This did little to calm the young man. In fact, it seemed to fuel him further. He took a step closer, his movements exaggerated, as if the space around him belonged to no one but him. "Oh, you're scared, aren't you?" he said, trying to provoke a reaction. "I bet you're scared." He pointed at the bystander and then looked around at the crowd, hoping for support or at least amusement. Some people were quietly laughing, but no one was stepping forward to join him. The bystander remained composed. He understood that the young man's behavior was not just about the guards or the crowd. It was about seeking attention and testing limits. "You don't need to do this," he said calmly. "There's no need to make a scene. You can walk away anytime." But the young man ignored the advice. Instead, he decided to escalate further. He waved his arms dramatically, pacing slightly, and shouted even louder. "Bet you can't even move. You're just a bunch of statues, nothing but statues." He was clearly enjoying the chaos, feeling the energy of the crowd feed his sense of importance. Some of the onlookers began recording the scene on their phones, murmuring comments like, "This is unbelievable," or "He's asking for trouble." A few parents held their children close, worried that the young man might act recklessly. Despite the crowd's mixed reactions, the young man seemed completely focused on himself, caught in the thrill of being watched. The bystander, realizing that the situation could soon escalate further, tried to create a small buffer between the young man and the rest of the crowd. He spoke again, this time with slightly more firmness but still without aggression. "You need to calm down. Please step back and stop bothering people." For a moment, the young man paused, looking around, measuring the response of the crowd. There was tension in the air, a subtle, quiet expectation that something was about to happen. The bystander watched his body language carefully. The young man's hands were clenching and unclenching, his movements sharp and restless. It was clear that if he continued, he might go beyond just shouting and gesturing. The guards, meanwhile, remained motionless, their presence commanding respect without any need for words. Their stillness was more powerful than any shout or gesture could be, and it created an invisible boundary that even the young man seemed hesitant to cross physically. The calm authority emanating from them was a silent but effective control over the situation. The young man, sensing that words alone were not having the desired effect, tried to provoke more. He stepped closer to the bystander, speaking loudly, challenging him. "You think you can stop me? I could take you on right now." The crowd gasped at his words, some stepping back instinctively. A few murmured warnings, while others tried to maintain a safe distance, watching the unfolding drama with a mix of fear and fascination. The bystander stayed composed. He did not raise his voice aggressively, did not move forward, and did not make any sudden movements that might escalate the tension. Instead, he relied on a calm authority, showing that he was confident and in control without needing to threaten or provoke. "This is your chance to stop," he said. "You don't want to be in trouble." The young man, feeling challenged by the calm response, hesitated for a brief moment. He was caught between continuing his aggressive behavior and stepping back. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, trying to gauge their reactions. Some were watching quietly, some recording, and some clearly disapproving. He realized that his attention-grabbing tactics were no longer fully entertaining to the crowd. They were starting to be seen as disruptive. He tried once more, raising his voice even higher, but there was a subtle shift in his tone now, a hint of frustration creeping in. The bystander's calm presence, combined with the silent authority of the king's guard, was beginning to have an effect. The young man could sense that he was no longer in complete control of the situation, and the thrill of being the center of attention was starting to fade slightly. At this point, a security officer who had been observing the scene from a short distance began to move closer. The officer's approach was deliberate but calm, signaling authority without aggression. The young man noticed the movement and turned slightly, his expression showing a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. He knew that this could change the dynamics, but he did not yet understand how serious it might become. The bystander remained steady, aware that the arrival of the officer might be enough to prevent further escalation. He kept his distance from the young man, maintaining a safe space while silently supporting the authority that was stepping in. The young man, still defiant, raised his voice once more, but the presence of the officer created an invisible line he dared not cross physically. The tension in the plaza was thick, but it was now moving toward resolution. The young man's energy, which had been so chaotic and unpredictable, was beginning to meet boundaries he could not ignore. The crowd watched, some with relief, some with curiosity, and some still amused by the audacity of his behavior. For a moment, it seemed as though he might back down. His gestures became slightly less aggressive, his voice slightly lower. But he was still struggling to let go of the spotlight. It was clear that he thrived on attention, and the presence of authority figures was challenging his sense of control. The bystander, seeing this subtle shift, remained patient. He knew that the young man's bravado would eventually meet the limits imposed by the crowd, the guards, and the approaching officer. All that was needed was calm observation, careful guidance, and a presence of authority that did not provoke further aggression. And so, in the midst of the plaza, a delicate balance began to form. The young man's defiance was still there, but it was now measured against calm authority and silent discipline. The stage was set for what might happen next, a moment that could either end peacefully or escalate further, depending on the choices of the young man. The morning sunlight continued to shine on the guards, reflecting off their polished boots and hats, casting long, sharp shadows across the plaza. The bystander stayed ready, calm, and focused, aware that patience and composure were now the most powerful tools in ensuring the situation remained under control. The young man, still loud and energetic, had yet to realize the full effect of the authority surrounding him. He was caught in the excitement of attention, unaware of how quickly it could turn into consequence. And so, the plaza remained tense, filled with anticipation, as everyone waited to see whether the young man would finally step back or continue testing the limits of the calm, disciplined world he had dared to challenge. The young man's energy had begun to shift from playful mischief to something more serious. The initial thrill of attention was still there, but now it was mixed with frustration. The crowd, sensing that the situation could escalate, held its collective breath. Everyone could feel the tension in the air, as if the plaza itself had grown quieter in anticipation of what might come next. The bystander, who had been observing quietly, noticed the subtle changes in the young man's behavior. His movements were faster, sharper, and more unpredictable. His voice, which had once carried a teasing tone, now had a sharper edge, almost like a challenge. The calm presence of the guards was still there, but he could sense that it might not be enough to prevent the young man from acting impulsively. Nearby, the security officer was closing the distance. He moved deliberately, with a quiet authority that demanded attention without raising his voice. The young man noticed him and turned, his defiance showing in his posture. He wanted to continue to dominate the scene, to prove that no one could control him. "What are you going to do?" he shouted, his voice echoing across the plaza. "Stop me, try it." The officer didn't respond with words. He didn't need to, his presence alone was commanding. The crowd instinctively gave him space, moving slightly back to ensure that there was a clear path for him to act if necessary. The young man's chest rose and fell quickly as he realized that the situation was becoming more serious than he had anticipated. The bystander stayed calm, keeping a safe distance, and spoke softly but firmly. "You don't need to do this," he said. "It's not worth it. You can walk away and still keep your dignity." But the young man was caught up in the energy of the crowd and his own defiance. He wasn't ready to back down. Instead, he raised his hands in a wild gesture and shouted insults, aimed both at the officer and the bystander. The words were still playful in tone, but the sheer volume and intensity made it clear that he was testing boundaries. Some onlookers began to film the scene on their phones, whispering to one another. "He's going too far," one woman said. "This is getting dangerous." Children were being guided closer to their parents, and even tourists who had come to see the ceremonial guard were now watching the drama unfold with concern. The officer stopped a few steps away, assessing the situation carefully. He knew that the young man was unpredictable, and he also knew that the presence of the crowd complicated matters. Any sudden or aggressive movement could cause panic or injury. He stayed calm, maintaining authority without provoking further escalation. The young man, sensing the officer's restraint, felt both challenged and excited. His body tensed as he considered his next move. He could sense the crowd's attention and the possibility of being filmed and remembered online. This thought seemed to encourage him to push further, to test limits just a little more. He took a step closer to the bystander, raising his voice even higher. "You think you're better than me? I could take you on right now," he shouted, pointing a finger aggressively. The crowd gasped, and some whispered warnings to him, hoping to diffuse the tension without creating a scene. The bystander remained composed, not taking a step back or reacting aggressively. He knew that any sudden movement could provoke a confrontation. "Step back and calm down," he said gently. "This is your chance to walk away without anyone being hurt." For a moment, the young man hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the guards, who remained perfectly still, unmoved by his provocations. Their calm presence seemed almost impossible to ignore, creating a barrier that he couldn't cross. He wanted a reaction, a sign that his actions mattered, but the guard's discipline held firm, leaving him frustrated. The officer took a small step closer, keeping his movements deliberate and controlled. His experience in handling difficult situations, allowed him to assess the young man's behavior without raising tension unnecessarily. He maintained eye contact, showing that he was prepared to act if needed, but not making any sudden gestures that could escalate the situation. The young man, however, misread the officer's calm as hesitation. He puffed out his chest and made another wild gesture, swinging his arms as if to show strength. "What are you waiting for?" he shouted. "Come on, try to stop me." The bystander, still calm, raised his hand slightly in a non-threatening gesture. "You don't want this," he said softly. "It's not worth it. Please, just step back." The young man's defiance remained, but there was now a subtle change in his energy. He realized that he was surrounded by authority, and any further reckless action could have consequences. His breathing became heavier and his gestures less controlled. He was beginning to feel the weight of the situation, though he still tried to maintain an appearance of bravado. The officer, seeing this, decided it was time to take action. He moved closer in a controlled manner, keeping a safe distance to avoid provoking the young man. His approach was careful, but firm, signaling that further misbehavior would not be tolerated. The young man noticed the movement and turned slightly, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The bystander continued to speak calmly, reinforcing the officer's presence without escalating tension. "This is your last chance," he said. "Step back and calm down, or you'll have to face consequences." The young man paused, looking at the officer, the bystander, and the crowd. The thrill of attention was still there, but now it was mixed with uncertainty and fear. He could feel the eyes of everyone around him, watching his next move, recording it, judging it. The moment had reached a critical point. His decision now would determine whether the situation ended peacefully or escalated further. He made one last wild gesture, swinging his arms in frustration, but it was weaker than before. The officer, ready and calm, stepped in smoothly and restrained him gently. The young man struggled briefly, still shouting, but the officer's training ensured that the restraint was safe and controlled. The bystander stepped back, giving space, while the crowd murmured, some relieved and some still curious. The young man was handcuffed, not harshly, but firmly. His shouting began to fade as he realized that the situation had moved beyond his control. The officer remained calm and professional, guiding him to a safer position while keeping the crowd at a respectful distance. The King's Guard continued their duties, unaffected by the drama, their presence silently reinforcing the authority that had brought the situation under control. The crowd began to relax, the tension dissipating as they saw that no one was hurt and that the young man was now under control. Some whispered to one another, commenting on the bravery and composure of the bystander and the skill of the officer. Others smiled quietly, finding humor in the absurdity of the young man's antics, even as they recognized the seriousness of the situation. The young man, now seated on the pavement and handcuffed, continued to mutter and protest, but his energy was clearly diminishing. He realized that the chaos he had created was over, at least for now. The crowd slowly began to return to their own activities, some resuming their sightseeing, others continuing to record the aftermath for social media. The bystander, though shaken slightly by the intensity of the situation, remained calm and observant. He knew that remaining composed had been key in preventing the situation from escalating further. The officer guided the young man away from the immediate area, ensuring that the rest of the crowd was safe and undisturbed. The King's Guard continued their ceremonial duties, their presence a reminder of the discipline and authority that maintained order in even the most unpredictable moments. The plaza, once again, returned to its normal rhythm, though the memory of the young man's antics lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. People began to discuss the incident quietly among themselves, sharing impressions and observations. Some admired the calm and authority shown by the bystander and the officer. Others laughed softly at the audacity of the young man's behavior, though they recognized the lesson in the consequences of overstepping boundaries. The young man, now under control, had become a minor spectacle, not for his courage or skill, but for the energy and chaos he had brought to the otherwise calm morning. It was a reminder that attention-seeking behavior could quickly lead to consequences when met with calm authority and discipline. The bystander, reflecting on the events, realized that patience and composure had been crucial. By remaining calm and non-confrontational, he had helped prevent a dangerous escalation and allowed trained authority to resolve the situation safely. It was a moment that highlighted the importance of understanding human behavior, reading the signs of potential conflict, and responding appropriately without anger or aggression. As the young man was guided away, the plaza slowly returned to its regular pace. Tourists resumed taking pictures of the King's Guard, families continued their strolls, and the normal rhythm of the morning returned. Yet the story of the young man's defiance and the calm, controlled response of those around him would linger in the memories of the witnesses for a long time. It was a morning that began with curiosity and ceremonial precision, had shifted into tension and chaos, and ended with a lesson in discipline, patience, and the importance of authority used wisely. And while the young man had hoped to be the center of attention, he had learned in his own way that actions have consequences, and that even boldness must be measured against the calm, patient, and disciplined forces of the world. The morning sun continued to shine over the palace grounds, casting long, warm beams over the plaza where the events of the day had unfolded. The young man, now handcuffed and sitting on the edge of a stone bench, was beginning to quiet down. His shouting had faded into mutters, his wild gestures replaced by restless movements and frustrated sighs. The adrenaline that had fueled him moments ago was slowly ebbing, leaving him with a mixture of embarrassment, anger, and a dawning awareness of the consequences of his actions. The bystander, who had remained calm throughout the chaos, observed him from a short distance. He felt a sense of relief that the situation had not escalated further and that no one had been harmed. People in the crowd were beginning to disperse, whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. The plaza, once tense and filled with energy, now carried a quieter, reflective air. The crowd's focus had shifted from shock and curiosity to contemplation and conversation. Some onlookers approached cautiously, still curious about the young man and the events that had transpired. A few offered quiet words to the bystander, thanking him for his calm presence. "You kept your cool," one person said softly. "I think that helped a lot." Others shook their heads, incredulous at the audacity of the young man and how close the situation had come to causing a real disturbance. The young man, still fidgeting under the watchful eyes of the officer, began to show signs of realizing that he had lost control. He looked around at the crowd, some of whom were filming or whispering to each other, and his expression shifted from defiance to embarrassment. It was clear that he had intended to be the center of attention, but now the attention was not what he had hoped for. Instead of admiration or laughter at his antics, he had drawn disapproval and consequence. The officer remained professional, calm, and deliberate in his actions. He guided the young man gently to a more secure position, ensuring that he remained seated and that the handcuffs were not causing any discomfort. His approach was firm but non-aggressive, showing that authority could be exercised with control and respect. The young man, realizing that resistance was futile, began to slump slightly in his seat, the fight in him giving way to a sense of resignation. The bystander, still observing, reflected on the scene. He knew that the young man's behavior had been a test of limits, both of his own patience and of the authority surrounding him. It had been a moment of tension, excitement, and unpredictability, but it had also been an opportunity for calm, measured intervention. By staying composed and not reacting impulsively, he had helped prevent the situation from escalating into something much more serious. The crowd, meanwhile, was beginning to disperse more noticeably. Families resumed their strolls through the plaza, tourists returned to photographing the King's Guard, and street performers continued their routines, as if trying to restore a sense of normalcy. Conversations among the onlookers shifted from speculation about the young man to admiration for the calmness and discipline displayed by those who had handled the situation. People began to whisper things like, "It could have ended much worse," or "That officer handled it perfectly." Even the King's Guard, who had remained steadfast and silent throughout the incident, became the focus of admiration once more. Their unwavering posture and discipline had been a key element in keeping the crowd calm and preventing further escalation. Observers commented quietly among themselves on how impressive it was that such authority could be maintained simply through presence and training, without a single word or aggressive action. The young man, seated and handcuffed, finally began to acknowledge the reality of his situation. He shifted uncomfortably, muttering to himself, and occasionally glancing at the bystander and the officer. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his actions had consequences. The energy and excitement that had fueled him earlier were now replaced by a sense of vulnerability. The crowd, which had once watched him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement, was now observing his restraint and the orderly resolution of the incident. As the officer spoke quietly to the young man, explaining the next steps and the reasons for his restraint, the bystander continued to watch. He noted the importance of calm communication in resolving conflicts. The officer's professional demeanor, combined with the bystander's steady presence, had created a controlled environment where the young man could express frustration without harming anyone. It was a lesson in patience, restraint, and the power of composed authority. Some onlookers lingered, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. They whispered quietly among themselves, speculating about what might happen next. Would the young man apologize? Would he try to argue? Would he learn from this experience? The plaza, which had been a stage for chaos moments before, had now transformed into a place of reflection, observation, and understanding. The young man's energy continued to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of the seriousness of the situation. He shifted in his seat, his movements slower and more measured. His attempts at defiance had diminished, and he began to realize that his actions had consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment. The attention he had sought had been fleeting, and the lesson he was learning was now becoming clear. The bystander, still maintaining a calm presence, considered how the crowd had influenced the situation. People's reactions, whispered warnings, cautious observation, and respectful distance had all played a role in containing the chaos. The young man had sought attention, but the collective calm authority of the bystander, the officer, and the King's Guard had reshaped the energy of the crowd, turning it from excitement into controlled observation. As minutes passed, the young man began to speak more quietly, no longer shouting but muttering under his breath. The officer responded calmly, explaining the process and ensuring that the young man understood what was happening. The handcuffs, while restrictive, were not harsh, and the young man began to settle, realizing that resistance was pointless and that cooperation would make the situation easier for everyone. The crowd, sensing the resolution of the incident, began to shift their attention back to the regular activities in the plaza. Tourists resumed photographing the ceremonial guard, families continued their strolls, and street performers returned to entertaining. The morning air, once charged with tension, now carried a sense of calm and normalcy. The young man, seated and handcuffed, had become a quiet figure amid the bustling plaza. His shouting had ceased, and he was now observing the reactions of the crowd around him. Some people offered sympathetic looks, understanding that everyone makes mistakes. Others watched with quiet amusement, remembering the wild energy he had displayed just moments before. The bystander remained near, a steady presence that reinforced calm and order. As the officer prepared to guide the young man away, he spoke in a calm and measured voice, explaining what would happen next. The young man listened quietly, nodding slightly, beginning to internalize the lesson that actions have consequences. The crowd continued to disperse, leaving the plaza almost as it had been before the incident, but with the memory of the drama lingering in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The king's guard, still standing perfectly erect, continued their ceremonial duties without interruption. Their presence remained a symbol of discipline, authority, and calm control. The bystander reflected on the entire event, recognizing the importance of patience, composure, and observation in moments of tension. The young man's behavior, while disruptive, had been met with measured authority that prevented escalation and ensured safety for everyone involved. As the morning progressed, the plaza returned fully to its normal rhythm. The young man, now guided away by the officer, had learned a subtle but important lesson about boundaries, respect, and consequences. The bystander watched him leave, understanding that calm presence and steady authority had been key to resolving what could have been a far more dangerous or chaotic situation. The crowd, finally dispersing, carried with them stories to tell. They spoke of the young man's audacity, the calmness of the bystander, and the professional skill of the officer. Many commented on the discipline of the king's guard, whose silent presence had been a pillar of control throughout the incident. The plaza, once again, was filled with tourists, families, and performers, but the memory of the morning's drama remained, a quiet reminder of how quickly ordinary moments can shift into unexpected events. In the end, the young man's moment of chaos had passed, replaced by reflection and understanding. The bystander, the officer, and the king's guard had all played crucial roles in containing the situation, demonstrating the power of calm authority, patience, and discipline. The plaza, alive with history and ceremony, had witnessed yet another story, one that would linger in the minds of those who had seen it for days, perhaps even weeks to come. The day at the palace gates slowly moved toward afternoon, but the story of the young man's defiance had already begun to spread through whispers, murmurs, and the quiet hum of social media. People in the plaza who had witnessed the event were talking among themselves, recalling each moment, the loud shouts, the wild gestures, the calm presence of the bystander, and the professional handling of the officer. The incident had left an impression not just for the chaos it caused, but also for the way it had been resolved. The young man, now escorted by the officer toward a more secure location, was noticeably quieter. His previous bravado had given way to reflection. Every step he took seemed heavier, as if the weight of what had happened was finally settling on him. He glanced around at the crowd that had watched him so intently, realizing that he had become the center of attention in a way he had not intended. The attention he had sought, full of admiration and laughter, had instead been replaced with judgment, caution, and lessons about respect. The bystander, who had observed and intervened calmly, stood back, watching as the young man was guided away. He felt a mixture of relief and quiet pride. Relief that the incident had ended safely, and pride in the fact that calmness and patience had made a real difference. He understood that his presence had provided a model of reason and restraint, showing the young man and the crowd that courage could take the form of calmness, not aggression. Tourists and locals alike began to discuss the incident in small groups, recounting the moments they had seen. Many spoke about the king's guard, whose silent discipline had played an important role in preventing escalation. "I can't believe how still they stayed," one tourist whispered. "Even with all that shouting, they didn't react at all. That's incredible discipline." Others focused on the young man, noting how his desire for attention had led to consequences he hadn't expected. "He seemed so confident at first," a local parent said, "but now he's paying for it. Actions have results no matter who you are." Meanwhile, the officer continued to guide the young man, explaining what would happen next. The conversation was calm and professional, avoiding anger or threats. "You made choices," the officer said, "and now there will be consequences. But you can cooperate, and it will go more smoothly for everyone involved." The young man listened quietly, realizing that cooperation was the better path, even if he still felt frustrated. Back in the plaza, the crowd was beginning to disperse, but many people lingered, discussing what they had just witnessed. Smartphones were filled with recordings of the incident, clips that would soon find their way online. People were already tagging the hashtag #TheKingsGuard, sharing the story, and commenting on the calm authority that had handled the chaos. Social media was buzzing with amusement, admiration, and lessons about patience and discipline. Some of the more reflective onlookers talked about the young man's behavior in terms of human nature. "It's amazing how easily attention can change someone's actions," one person observed. He wanted to be noticed, and that desire made him act recklessly. But it also showed how authority and calmness can guide situations to safety. Others nodded in agreement, appreciating the subtle balance of excitement and restraint that had defined the morning's events. As the young man was led away, he could hear the soft chatter of people behind him, some whispering judgments, others recounting moments that had amused them. He realized that his actions, meant to gain respect or attention, had instead become a lesson for many. The embarrassment, the frustration, and the restraint he experienced in that moment were teaching him more than shouts or gestures ever could. The bystander reflected quietly on how the situation had unfolded. It was a delicate balance between chaos and calm, excitement and restraint. If the young man had encountered someone aggressive or reactive, the outcome could have been very different. But patience, observation, and steady authority had prevented harm and turned a potentially dangerous confrontation into a lesson about respect, discipline, and the power of calmness. In the plaza, the King's Guard continued their ceremonial duties, unaffected by the events that had briefly disrupted the morning. Their presence remained a symbol of stability, discipline, and quiet authority. Observers admired not only their training, but also their ability to remain composed under provocation. The incident had highlighted the contrast between impulsive behavior and controlled professionalism, a visual lesson in self-discipline for all who watched. The young man, now seated in a more secure area under supervision, began to reflect on his choices. He realized that his desire to provoke and disrupt had consequences far beyond his control. His shouting and gestures, meant to assert dominance and gain attention, had only led to restraint and observation. The lesson was clear: actions carry weight, and behavior in public spaces can have consequences not just for oneself but for everyone around. As the day progressed, social media clips began circulating, showing the young man's antics alongside the calm intervention of the bystander and officer. Comments poured in from viewers worldwide, many expressing admiration for the composed response and discipline of those handling the situation. "This is a perfect example of staying calm under pressure," one comment read. "Patience and authority are more powerful than anger." Others laughed quietly at the young man's wild gestures, but recognized the lesson in restraint and consequences. The young man, hearing about the online attention, felt a mixture of embarrassment and realization. He had wanted to be the center of attention, but the focus was not on his boldness. It was on the calm, composed actions that had resolved the situation. He began to understand the true impact of behavior, how actions can shape perception, and how consequences follow even the smallest provocations. The bystander, now walking away from the plaza, reflected on the power of observation and calm action. He had not needed to act aggressively or shout to maintain order. Instead, by staying composed, providing steady guidance, and allowing trained authority to intervene, he had helped turn chaos into a teachable moment. The lessons of the morning would remain with him, a reminder of the impact one calm presence can have in a tense situation. Meanwhile, the plaza slowly returned to normal life. Tourists resumed their photographs, families strolled together, and street performers entertained without interruption. Yet, the memory of the morning's events lingered. People would recall the young man's audacity, the calm response of the bystander, the professionalism of the officer, and the silent authority of the king's guard. It was a story that would be shared again and again, illustrating the delicate balance between impulsive behavior and disciplined response. The young man, after a period of reflection, began to show signs of understanding. His body language softened, his gestures became less aggressive, and his mutters grew quieter. He realized that the energy he had tried to wield for attention had been countered not by anger but by calm, measured action. It was a subtle but powerful lesson in the importance of self-control, patience, and respect for rules and authority. As the afternoon continued, the story of the incident spread beyond the plaza. Social media shared clips, hashtags trended, and discussions arose about discipline, behavior, and authority. People were amazed at how a potentially chaotic situation had been resolved through calmness, observation, and measured intervention. The young man had inadvertently become a teacher of lessons in human behavior, demonstrating the consequences of impulsive actions and the value of restraint. By the end of the day, the young man had been released under supervision, with a clear understanding of the importance of responsible behavior. He had learned a significant lesson, that boldness and attention-seeking might seem exciting in the moment, but patience, respect, and calm authority were far more powerful in shaping outcomes. The bystander left the plaza quietly, reflecting on the morning's events. He had seen firsthand the importance of maintaining composure under pressure, and had witnessed the impact of calm authority in preventing escalation. The experience would remain with him as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful action is no action at all. Simply being present, calm, and observant can change the course of events. The king's guard continued their ceremonial duties as if nothing had happened, yet their presence had been the invisible anchor that had maintained order. Their discipline had reminded everyone watching of the strength found in calm, silent authority. The plaza, now returned to its routine rhythm, held the echoes of lessons learned, stories shared, and a moment in time that had turned a potential conflict into a powerful example of patience, control, and the consequences of impulsive behavior. In the end, the young man's attempt at mischief had become a story of reflection, learning, and respect. The bystander's calm, the officer's professionalism, and the king's guard's discipline had all contributed to a resolution that was both safe and instructive. The morning, which had begun with chaos, ended as a quiet demonstration of the power of composure, the importance of rules, and the lasting lessons of human behavior in public spaces. And so, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the plaza returned fully to normal life. People moved on, stories were told, lessons were shared, and the young man left with a new understanding of respect, authority, and the true meaning of consequence. What had started as a loud, chaotic challenge ended as a calm, measured example of how restraint, observation, and discipline could turn even the most unpredictable moments into valuable learning experiences.